Gentlemen, style doesn't vanish overnight. It fades slowly. Men once shaved with straight razors, carried pocket watches, wore hats, vests, and suspenders as part of daily life. Today, most of these are gone. In this video, we're breaking down why men stopped wearing and using items that were once essential. Not because they were ineffective, but because the world around them changed. When you understand why these pieces disappeared, you understand how modern men and modern style were shaped. The year is 1921. In the United States, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier has just been dedicated. Over in Russia, Lenin's introducing his new economic policy. The Communist Party has been founded over in China. The Allies have instituted reparations on the defeated powers of World War I, and as such, within a couple months, Hitler becomes leader of the Nazi Party, and over in Italy, Benito Mussolini's National Fascist Party has been established. But there are some bright spots. A young Albert Einstein is awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, and Edith Wharton becomes the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Up in Canada, they've discovered insulin, and over in France, we've now got a vaccine for tuberculosis. And how could we forget Margaret Gorman becoming the first Miss America? But all of that pales in comparison to a monumental shift that has just happened in men's grooming. The sales of safety razors have now surpassed that of straight razors, which is a big deal as straight razors in one form or another have dominated men's grooming for over 10,000 years. And I'm sure, as all of you guys know, the decline didn't stop there. In fact, today, less than 1% of men have ever even had a straight razor shave. So what happened? Why did men stop using straight razors after almost 10,000 years of domination? What led to their downfall in less than 100? Well, to understand the downfall of the straight razor, let's go back to the beginning. Now, the first straight razors weren't really razors, they were flint and obsidian blades. Archaeologists have clear evidence that early humans used sharpened stones for trimming beards, for cutting hair, and for general grooming. And yes, I know that sounds painful, and calling these razors is probably a bit of a stretch, but come on, early man was doing what he could with what he had. Now, when it comes to straight razors, things really took off in the Bronze and Iron Ages. As you can imagine, as metalworking advanced, rudimentary razors made of bronze or iron began appearing in various civilizations. Artifacts from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Greeks and Roman Empire show these prototypes. Now, in particular, it was the Egyptians that really led the way. For them, it was a sign of status, a sign that you were above the average laborer if you had a completely shaven face. In fact, it was a sign of cleanliness, hence where we get the term clean shaven. And the razors and artifacts from this time period are very elaborate. The royals and priests of the time used specially designed razors, and they were sometimes buried with them. Yeah, I mean, come on, in the afterlife, you want to make sure that you're looking good. Now, for the Greeks and Romans, having a clean shaven face was a sign that you were civilized. The Romans especially, at least the ones with money, prided themselves on their daily shaving routines. That being said, for the average Roman, he did have an issue with his razor occasionally rusting, and the way he would overcome that is through proper maintenance with a sharpening stone and a strop, which we'll get to here in a few minutes. But yeah, the use of straight razors continued on throughout the Middle Ages. And with that being said, we saw the emergence of a new class of worker. Barbers. Now, during this time period, not only were they skilled with straight razors, but hey, you could go to your barber also to get minor surgery. He didn't really know what he was doing, but you know, he had something sharp and he had a 25% survival rate. So hey, you might as well go in there and give it a shot, right? Now, during the Renaissance, we saw a number of improvements, especially in the forging of the razors with steel. Cities in England like Sheffield or Solingen in Germany, which is still known for its steel today, with their blacksmiths and craftsmen, they were able to forge some of the best razors at the time. Also, we saw the continued rise of barbers and surgeons. Again, these were individuals who were skilled in the use of these tools, knew how to select the best, and a good one at least could start piecing together clues and details that, like if I get a deep cut on this guy, I probably need to have him wash this with some alcohol in order to make sure it doesn't get infected and kill him. Seriously, one of the problems with early shaving is the fact that small nicks and cuts could actually lead to an infection. In fact, just in the last couple hundred years, a number of men have lost their lives due to shaving infections. Guys like Michael F. Farley, who died strangely enough in 1921, one. He was a rags to riches Horatio Alger story of an immigrant who came and became a congressman, but died before he could have much impact due to a shaving cut. The musician Alexander Shrapin, an amazing pianist who once wrote that I am God. Well, it turned out he wasn't. He ended up dying of syphilis or blood poisoning when he nicked himself at the age of 43 using a straight razor. We also had John Thoreau, the brother of the famous Henry David Thoreau. A few days after cutting himself, he ended up with lockjaw and ended up dying in his brother's arms. And an interesting note about that, Henry David was so affected by the death of his brother that he didn't want to hear from anyone. He wanted to go away. And his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson said, hey, you got that cabin over on the pond. How about you go there and just do some writing? Well, he took this advice and America ended up with some of the best writing of that century. But let's get back to Sheffield. Let's get back to Sulligan, because what happened here was the Industrial Revolution. And the big part for shaving is that all of a sudden, mass manufacturing of great quality razors was possible. Straight razors became better quality and they became more affordable. All of a sudden, the market was flooded. Pretty much every man either owned a straight razor or went to a barber with a straight razor so that he could look presentable. It was also at this time that we got the standard design of a folding handle with a straight steel blade. To this day, we still use pretty much the same design. And it's safe to say by the year 1890, every household in the United States, England, and most of the Western world, you would find a straight razor and somebody that knew how to use it. And it was at about this time as well that barber shops became the hub of where men like to gather. They, of course, were getting their grooming, their shaving done, but they also like to drink some whiskey. They like to talk. They like to spend time with each other. Now, before we go any farther, let's define exactly what a straight razor is. First up, you've got the blade, a single large cutting edge that folds into the handle. Next up, you've got the pivot pin. This connects the blade to the handle, allowing the blade to fold. Now, in particular, let's talk about the handle, also known as the scale. Now, traditionally, handles are made from a material that's going to give a man grip whenever it gets wet. So we're talking wood, bone, horn, and later on, when we got into mass manufacturing, plastics. Now, historically and throughout history, we've also seen handles be very decorative. And in fact, if there's any good argument for owning a straight razor nowadays, I think it's because a lot of them are almost works of art. Now, a couple of details about the blade you want to pay attention to are the point and the grind. Now, the point is going to be the end of the blade. You're going to see rounded points, square points, or French. Each offers a slightly different experience, although at the end of the day, they all get the job done. It really comes down to what do you want and what's available to you. Next up, you've got the grind, and this is how thick or thin the blade is. Full hollow grinds are going to be sharper and also more delicate. Wedge grinds, on the other hand, are going to be sturdier, but sometimes require more force to cut. Now, the most common materials we're going to see out there are carbon steel. Now, the advantage is here, it's relatively easy to sharpen and hone. It takes a very nice edge, while the con is it's susceptible to rust and it needs to be dried thoroughly after each use. Next up, you're going to see stainless steel razors. Again, the pro here is they're more resistant to corrosion, but on the flip side, the harder steel makes them more difficult to sharpen. And if you look around, you're also going to see shavettes. Now, shavettes are actually a hybrid and they use a disposable razor. And these are great for guys maybe just starting off, or if you're a barber, this is where you're often going to see it, as due to regulations, they need to be able to have a blade that can be disposable. Now, one of the things with a straight razor is it doesn't stand alone. It actually needs a few accessories with it. First up, you're going to see the strop. Now, the purpose of the strop is to align and polish the razor's edge before each use. Now, most of them out there are going to be made from leather, either a horse hide or a cow hide, although sometimes you'll see linen or canvas backings. You're also going to see honing stones. Basically, these are for when the blade needs to be resharpened. Yes, you can run it up and down the strop, but eventually you're going to need to get in there and sharpen the blade. And for this purpose, you'll use a water stone, a synthetic stone, or even diamond plates. Now, the big difference between the stones is going to be the grit level, and I recommend if you're just getting started, don't even worry about this. Just simply reach out to the manufacturer. They should have a process where you can send the blade back to get sharpened every few months. And of course, if you're going to be shaving, you want a lubricant. But in this case, I really would recommend a shaving soap. Now, shaving soaps are not like regular soap. They're going to have a lot more glycerin because their job is to protect the skin from the razor by giving you that thin surface that the razor basically glides over. And that's the purpose of the lather. Protection. So make sure when you're going over even a second time, if you've removed the shaving soap, actually apply it on again. And to do that, you want to use a badger hair brush. Now, there are synthetic options out there. They're going to be less expensive, but historically, badger hair gave the best application when it comes to shaving soaps. Now, what about post-shave? Really important with a straight razor, especially if you've got a cut or if you don't even see the cut. And this is why aftershaves contained so much alcohol. They were actually there as an antiseptic. Nowadays, you're going to see a lot less of that. You're going to see balms out there that are very comforting. But if you are using a straight razor, hey, you are still susceptible to a deep cut. So do use an aftershave. Do use something that's going to clean up the area, especially if you cut yourself. Now, on a side note, if you really want to get a straight razor shave, I do recommend just simply look in your area. There are many barbers that are going to offer this as a professional service. Now, I've done this a couple times. If you make sure that whoever you're going to has good reviews, guys, this could be a great, enjoyable experience. Let's face it, the ladies, they have so many options. When it comes to spas and things like this is a very classic masculine thing to actually try. And yeah, don't be afraid to pamper yourself, because if you look at the history, again, barber shops used to be the place, and still in some places today, where men would congregate, be able to talk shop, be able to relax, and when they leave, feel like $1,000,000. So what happened? How did straight razors fall from the peak of everyone using them to now 100 years later? Pretty much nobody does. Well, the fall started in the late 19th century with the development of the safety razor. In 1901, a gentleman named King Gillette patented the safety razor as we know it. Now, the idea of the safety razor is simple, and the name implies this was going to be a much safer way for an average guy to perform the shaving ritual himself. First up, the razor was smaller. There was a protective guard over the razor, and it became a lot more difficult for a guy to cut his throat whenever he was shaving. And that's what actually the straight razor was sometimes called, the cutthroat razor, because if not used properly, it could lead to some pretty nasty cuts. Now, the guys behind the safety razor were pretty smart. They were good marketers, and they were pushing hard, but it was really World War I that changed everything. You see, the US military issued Gillette safety razors to the doughboys. So basically, you had millions of young men using a new device, seeing how great it was, how easy it was to use, and they were distributing these all over the world, wherever they traveled. And once they returned back home, guess what? They didn't want to ditch the safety razor. This thing was easier to use. It did an excellent job. And as far as they were concerned, based off of what they valued, the safety razor was better than the straight razor. And again, on top of that, King Gillette just kept advertising. He kept at it with marketing. In fact, by 1921, the word Gillette pretty much meant the same thing as a razor in most people's minds. Now, those two reasons make a lot of sense of getting the younger men on board, but why did even older guys switch over when they were so used to using a straight razor? Well, first up, it comes to safety. So a lot of guys, they were always very careful about going with that straight razor shave. They would either go to a professional, or when they did it themselves, they were very, very careful. It was an elaborate procedure. Safety razors, to be honest, you could be less careful. You could be almost, you could just simply go quicker. It not only saved you time, but you just simply didn't have to worry. Yeah, you would occasionally get a nick or a cut, but it wasn't nearly as deep. People would try the safety razor one time and realize, hey, this is just so much safer than, those cutthroats. And let's talk about that convenience and time. Believe it or not, there was a time period when people didn't move as fast. But as we entered the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden people started working by the hour. That stuff was measured. More people moved to the cities. They were in line with the clocks that were just telling us faster, faster. People were looking for ways to save an extra few minutes. And going to a safety razor versus a straight razor, we're talking about a good 15 to 10 minutes. Even if you're skilled with the straight razor, the safety razor was still a faster option. And that brings me to the next point about skill involved with a straight razor. So unless you had a really steady hand and you knew what you were doing, a straight razor wasn't something that you just picked up. In fact, as a guy that has taught himself to shave with a straight razor, I have to admit, the first time I did it, I was scared. I mean, I had great tools, but up to that point, I just used pretty much cartridge razors. I hadn't even used a safety razor at that point, but I wanted to test it a few years, it was like a decade back. I remember even creating a video and doing this, and I was really nervous that I was going to injure myself. For some of the guys out there that have cut themselves bad, they don't want to go back to that. They simply want a tool that gets the job done. And if that tool doesn't require any training or knowledge, all the more power to it. And let's talk about the nail in the coffin: maintenance and cost. So a straight razor, in general, costs more than a safety razor. In addition, if you own a straight razor, you know that after you use it every time, you need to run it over the strop. You need to make sure you don't want any rust getting on there. You want to keep the blade sharp. Safety razors, on the other hand, after you've used the blade maybe a couple times, you simply throw it out and you get a new one, and they're incredibly cheap and, again, incredibly sharp. And in fact, to this day, the safety razor is probably one of the best options out there for most men. I know a lot of you guys have gone towards cartridge razors or electric razors. Again, those are fine options, but if you deal with any types of bumps, any type of irritation, or you just simply want a more affordable shave, seriously, look at a safety razor. So if you ask anyone here in Wisconsin about the origins of the comb, they're going to tell you it was invented by Arthur Herbert Fonzarelli, aka Fonzie, aka the Fonz. Seriously, if you don't know this character, ask your dad, ask your granddad. The Fonz in the 1970s was the epitome of cool. He was a greaser, he rode a motorcycle, and he was easily the most popular character on the most popular show in America, Happy Days, which aired from 1974 to 1984. As you can see, I was in Milwaukee paying my respects to the Fonz, and I got his permission, his thumbs up, to break an uncomfortable truth to you. And that is that most men don't carry a comb anymore, which you probably think is obvious, but just one generation ago, no man would leave his house without a comb in his back pocket, and that had been the case for not just 50 years or 100 years. Nope, the comb as an accessory carried by men and women goes back actually to 8,000 BC. So what happened? Why, after 10,000 years, did men stop carrying combs? So when it comes to accessories, it's hard to beat the comb. Archaeologists have recovered combs that are over 8,000 years old. These tools dating from the Neolithic period. It's not known exactly if these earliest combs were used to style hair, but it is known that they were used to help remove lice from hair. Which, if you're a parent with a kid in a public school, it's kind of reassuring, if not funny, to know that our ancient ancestors were using the same tools to remove those disgusting parasites, which today we are still battling. Now, when it comes to styling, it was probably the Egyptians that used it more for definitely ceremonial purposes. We go back to 3,500 to 3,900 BC. In various tombs, archaeologists have found finely carved bone and ivory combs. And if you could afford to own a tool like this, it was also a sign of social status. And now, of course, combs could be made from other materials like wood. And it's also safe to say these wooden combs were easier to make. They were probably much more prolific in production. But because they were made from wood, we don't have too many ancient ones left until you get into the last 1,000 years. Then we go look at Viking culture, tons of wooden combs. And in fact, in Viking graves, you can oftentimes find a wooden folded comb. If you think about one of the first everyday carries right there, yeah, those Vikings, they loved their combs, had to brush those beards and keep clean of any insects, right? Now, if you know your history on brushes and combs, you probably know one of the oldest companies out there is Kent. Founded in the year 1777, Kent Brushes to this day continues to manufacture not only brushes, but combs and a variety of other grooming tools. But the company I want to talk about in today's video is the one that really put the comb on the map, and that is Ace. Founded by Charles Goody in 1885, Ace hard rubber combs very quickly set the standard for mass manufactured combs throughout the world. Made from a hard rubber, as the name implies, these combs were non-static, made from heat-resistant ebonite, and were available at barbershops around the world, which, in case you didn't know, was a hub that pretty much every man was in at least once a week, getting a shave, getting a cut, getting a trim. Now, at this point, combs were an accessory, but they weren't an accessory that every man was carrying every single day, everywhere he went. However, this started to change in the 1920s. And of course, the culprit here was Hollywood. Early Hollywood stars, the male leads, in order to appear more consistent through their scenes, would often use heavy hair products to keep their hair in place during the filming. As such, these actors all of a sudden started setting style, setting the fashion of the time, and the hairstyles that we saw come out of the 1920s and 1930s had looks that kept every hair in place. Now, these early pomades, they were heavy and they weren't perfect, and they did not keep your hair in place throughout the day. You had to touch them up multiple times. And this is what made the carrying of the comb really important. You had to be able to rebrush your hair with a tool that was easy to carry, that you could pull out at a moment's notice. And as you can imagine, this constant brushing was actually pretty tough on the combs. So early combs were breaking, and that became a major selling point in the 1920s and 1930s, is the unbreakability of a comb, which maybe doesn't sound like a big deal now, but this is early plastics. This is early rubbers. So in this industry, they were constantly coming out with new formulations that were not only more lightweight, they were less brittle, they could bend just the right amount, but still be able to handle a full head of thick hair. Now, up to this point, Hollywood had accelerated the adoption of the combs, but it was World War II that put it on steroids. You see, for anyone that hasn't served in the military, you don't know paperwork. You don't know grooming codes. Yes, we have a rule for everything. In fact, in my Marine Corps, our Marine Corps Uniform Regulations, which is a document that every Marine has to follow when he or she dresses themselves, yeah, that document alone has 267 pages of goodness. At least the last time I checked. Now, the good news is it does come in a pocket-sized version, oorah. But seriously, during World War II, they had very strict regs on how a man's hair should look. And guess what was standard issue? a comb. And as everyone knows, if you're in the military and you need it, you will get it issued to you. That's why so many guys are single, because they're like, hey, the Army, the Navy, they didn't issue me a wife, so, I don't need one. But seriously, the issued comb, made to be tough, this thing could be thrown into a duffel bag. You didn't have to worry about it breaking. And how to use it was even put into Army promotional videos. Seriously, they would show you how to clean your rifle and then how to comb your hair. All of this set up the 1950s. We saw the rise of the greaser. You had millions and millions of men sporting pomodors, ducktails. Everyone's using a heavy pomade. Everyone's combing their hair multiple times a day. Hollywood continued to throw fuel on the fire with movies like Rebel Without a Cause. Elvis, of course, was becoming popular and loved pulling out his comb and using it in front of the crowds. There was even a novelty song, Cookie Cookie, Loan Me Your Comb, that sold 1 million copies and went up to number 4 on the Billboard Top 100 in 1959. All of this resulted in Ace selling over 50 million combs a year and owning 2/3 of the comb market, and combs, in terms of total hair accessories, accounted for 1/3 of all retail sales. And then, just like that, the winds changed. Some people trace it back to the Beatles, others maybe the hippie movement, but all of a sudden, hair started to grow longer. Hippies with their long hair decided to put nothing in it at all, going more natural. For those that decided to style their hair, all of a sudden they actually had more tools. Hair dryers were being used and could help shape hair by heating it. Hairsprays emerged and all of a sudden could keep hair in place without constant recombing. And by 1974, pocket comb sales were down by 30%. And the 1980s didn't help. All of a sudden, we start seeing messy hairstyles. Alcohol-based gels and mousses all of a sudden offered all-day looks, and brushes were a better tool. They were being made smaller, and for that reason, they started replacing combs. Spiked hair looks, flat tops became all the rage without a comb in sight. And in 1987, the once giant Ace combs was sold to Goody for $3.5 million, a fraction of what that company had been worth just 2 decades before. And if things couldn't get worse, well, you didn't tell the comb about the 1990s. Grunge and Britpop popularized intentionally messy textures. Bedhead, hairstyles that used fibers and wax that were being styled with the fingers. This was what was in, and that perfect look that a comb gives you, yeah, that had been out for decades. So, is the comb dead? Well, not exactly. Let's talk about the show Mad Men. From 2007 to 2015, all of a sudden there's a resurgence of these 1950s, 1960s New York advertising man look, and companies like Kent, in just a period of a couple years, had doubled their sales in the US. So let's answer the question, why did the comb disappear? First up, stronger, better products. Early pomades. These were products that didn't have a whole lot of hold. They were heavy, and it was the weight that was actually doing the holding. But throughout the day, a man needed a comb in order to get back that perfect look that he would lose naturally throughout the day and being active. By the 1960s and 70s, when it comes to keeping a man's hair in place, he's got a lot more options. And in fact, today, even classically made pomades have a lot more hold in them, so you don't have to comb multiple times a day, if at all. Now, right with that, the second reason the comb pretty much disappeared is a changing in hairstyle preferences. Combs are excellent at combing down hair and keeping it straight. However, if you want to go for more of a tousled look, if you want to add a bit more texture, depth, then you're going to need specialty brushes, heating tools like hair dryers, and a comb becomes very limited in its ability to give you what you need. And let's talk about the loss of cultural icons. So throughout the 1950s, men like Elvis Presley and James Dean were leading the way with the comb. Throughout the 1960s, we saw this pretty much drop off, and yeah, there was a bit of a resurgence in the 1970s with the Fonz, but it's safe to say until the rise of Don Draper, he was one of the last big influencers to shape the habits of young men. And let's face it, when it comes to character, the Fonz, a much better influence. And in today's modern age, let's talk about pocket real estate. As you guys know, there are entire channels that are about everyday carry, and the big push there for most is to reduce what you carry, but to use and need everything that you do have. Well, guess what? In this push towards efficiency and with the rise of cell phones, AirPods, and all the other things people carry, yeah, the comb, despite its small size, has gotten pushed out. So in 1918, there was a lot going on in the world. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Great War ended. The H1N1 virus, known as the Spanish flu, ravaged the world and in particular targeted young people. President Wilson released his 14 points. The Boston Red Sox defeated the Chicago Cubs to win the World Series. U.S. unemployment was at 1.4% and a stamp cost 3 cents. And buried under all that, a lesser known but important fact to us men of culture, statistically, we were at peak mustache. Seriously, gents, with 73% of grown men wearing some type of facial hair, 66% chose to wear a mustache. Now, I say chose loosely because there are regulations going on that outlawed beards in certain situations, but if we look back, we can see that there were also trends, mustache crazes going on back in 1899, where 65% of men chose to wear a mustache of the 88% of the total population that sported facial hair. And on a side note, you can see we had peak facial hair in general in 1887, when 96% of men wore facial hair on a daily basis. So based off those numbers, what happened? A century later, we've got less than 30% of men wearing facial hair, and of that, only 2% wearing mustaches. Why did men stop wearing it? So to start things off, let's talk about the history of the mustache. But to do that, we need to first talk about the history of facial hair. Now, since the beginning, men have been growing facial hair. But it wasn't until about 10,000 years ago that we have archaeological evidence that men were actually starting to style their facial hair. Seriously, they were using clamps, shells, and rocks to cut and to shape and to pluck facial hair into certain configurations. Later, with the invention of bronze, metals, and crude razors, the Egyptians and other cultures took it to a whole other level, especially for religious reasons. They wanted to have a certain type of look. And let's just say that some of these guys really cared about their facial hair. In fact, in the 14th century, we find knights, their armor was actually made in a way to accommodate their, yes, beautiful facial hair. Seriously, Edward, the Prince of Wales, on his tome in Canterbury Cathedral, it shows the prince in full battle dress with chainmail encasing his face and neck, but allowing his long whiskers to flow over the top. But it was really the Elizabethan era, and King James I, when he came to the British throne, he was so proud of his dapper mustache that he had basically tons of art made with this. His son, King Charles I, would go on to make the goatee and the handlebar mustache iconic. You got to understand that these rulers at the time were setting the fashion trends. If you wanted to be hip, if you wanted to be in, then you copied what these guys were doing. And that's why Sir Anthony Van Dyck and his portraits that were passed around and the fashion trends that ensued, everybody wanted to have a Van Dyck facial hairstyle. Unless you didn't, unless you wanted to push back, unless you wanted to be a little bit of a revolutionary like Oliver Cromwell. And we look at his very frugal mustache that he sported. And even after revolutions, the mustache continued to be a symbol of power. King Charles II, he ruled with a mustache from 1660 to 1685. And what's funny is you look at some of these portraits of him in his early teens, notice he's still got that big burly mustache. Yeah, somebody here was brown nosing. Now really quick, pop quiz. Let's see if you can identify the man behind the mustache. So this first mustache right here, pretty easy, but yeah, I mean, who do you think this is? Guys, it is Charlie Chaplin, not Adolf Hitler. I know some of you guys thought, but here's the thing is that both of them sported this mustache. Charlie Chaplin had it first. Adolf Hitler later on picked this up, and this was actually a pretty popular mustache at the time, but because of the association with Hitler, this is something, unless you're Michael Jordan, you're not going to be rocking it. Next up, this one right here, a little bit more artistic, especially if you like, you like clocks that are melting all over the place. Who is this right here? Salvador Dali. Now this one, we're going back a little bit farther, but very distinctive. Civil War, anybody guess this one? Okay, right here, Ambrose Burnside. Now this one right here, if you were an outlaw and you're in Kansas or maybe Tombstone, Arizona, you see this mustache coming at you, you basically drop your weapons and you just surrender because, yeah, anyone know? Wyatt Earp. Now, what about this mustache right here? This guy works in what? Parks and Recreation. He's got a pretty cute but weird secretary. And yeah, he does not want to be bothered with anything. That is Ronald Ulysses Swanson. So now let's start to talk about the fall of the mustache and facial hair in general. So we saw at the end of the 19th century a stronger association of what caused infections. Germs, all of a sudden, Pasteur and everything that we're seeing, we are aware that you've got to maintain cleanliness, and beards were seen as unclean. Seriously, in New York, 1902, milkmen all of a sudden have to get rid of their whiskers and be clean shaven. Notice I didn't say completely shaven. I said clean shaven. King Gillette, 1904, all of a sudden starts making these razors more available. And we see hospitals throughout the UK basically tell their doctors, workers, everyone needs to be clean shaven for the patients. Men are creatures of habit. They did not want to give up their facial hair. And in 1910, we still saw almost 75% of men sporting beards, mustaches, and the like. That being said, new habits can be formed, especially when you join the military. 1914, the Great War starts. And all of a sudden, we have gas being used. So gas masks are issued. And guess what? If you've got a beard, you cannot get a great seal with a good gas mask. And most of the gas masks were not that great. So you wanted to make sure that you were shaven so that you could get some protection from that mustard gas, or whatever it may be. And guys, it was something that regulations came down. Hey, you got to be completely shaven. Now, officers and certain levels of enlisted men were actually allowed to maintain, guess what? A mustache, well trimmed within regs. And all of a sudden, we saw the rise of the mustache. And this is when we had peak mustache, because you could actually still have something that was masculine, something manly, that facial hair, but you just couldn't have the beard. Now, after the Great War, going through the 1920s, 1930s, this is when we saw the mustache come in its own. All of a sudden, you have all these men returning with these new habits, and guess what? They love that mustache. And for that 20 to 30 years, we saw the mustache just simply become one of the more dominant pieces. And that's why when we look at movies throughout that time period, pictures, any type of media, we see men in a variety of different mustaches. Pencil thin mustache, thicker mustaches, but mustaches are all over the place. And the loser here was the beard. Yes, the beard started to make a comeback in the 1920s, but it faltered off. And all of a sudden you saw fashion trends. You saw the rise of Hollywood. You saw all these actors, all of these people that we're looking up to are wearing mustaches, not beards. And all of a sudden that became the fashion trend. Something that not only the younger guys were doing, but some of the older guys were trying as well. All that being said, facial hair in general continued to decline with the proliferation of the safety razor, a huge improvement from the straight razor, which is beautiful, but can be dangerous, especially in a guy that doesn't know how to use it. All of a sudden, shaving was easy, and we continued to see not only the mustache decline, but the beard and deft sideburns completely disappeared as a style. And World War II didn't help any. Again, the regulations kicked in. Different services had different regulations, but usually when you're going through boot camp, guess what? No facial hair at all. And again, men are creatures of habit, and we can develop new habits, especially when you've got a drill instructor yelling at you. And all of a sudden, you know what? You go 3 to 4 years shaving every single day or when you can, and all of a sudden you get used to it. This becomes your new look. You get out of the military in the 1940s, 1950s. All of a sudden, it is the decade, the years of conforming to the fashion, to the times. And this takes us to the 1948 election, very close between Dewey and Truman. Right here, you've got pictures of the two candidates, and guess what? It was Dewey's mustache, according to some researchers, why a number of women did not vote for him, possibly men. But the reason being is that many women felt that this was a guy that was stuck in tradition. He was not going to be sensitive to women's issues. And that takes me to the next reason, which I know will be somewhat controversial, but that is because of the demands of women. And this is something that's interesting because you read any of the Cosmopolitans, any of the books, even today, they talk about, can a man look good, sexy in a mustache? And a lot of women are all over the place on this. If you listen to them, you are in trouble because they're going to say, yeah, a guy can pull it off if he does the right look. Otherwise, it is horrible. Now, that type of research I wouldn't listen to, but they do have a point that Howard Taft was the last president elected that had a mustache. No president since then has had a mustache because research does show that women feel a guy with facial hair, he may come off as more masculine, but guess what? He also seems less attuned to their issues. So it's safe to say politicians took note. And when you got the guys at the top not wearing beards, not sporting mustaches, all of a sudden, guess what? We start thinking, we see the fashion trends, you see everyone else stop sporting mustaches and beards. Now, of course, there are guys that buck the trend. 1980, you got Freddie Mercury sporting his mustache and everyone's complaining. There were all of these women saying, oh, I hate the look. I mean, jokes on them, right? And Freddie Mercury. But point being is that he's like, I don't care. I'm wearing this for myself. In fact, in a concert, he asked people what they thought. He got, some jeers. He got some, yells. And he's like, I don't give a damn what you think. I'm going to wear it for me. You've also got Anthony Kiedis, the frontman for Red Hot Chili Peppers. Did I pronounce his name correctly? If I messed it up, let me know in the comments. I love that band. But in 2011, he started sporting a mustache and they started like a petition online. A lot of women saying, hey, he's got to get rid of it. And he's like, he just thinks of it as a joke. He's going to do what he wants to do. And this takes me to the next reason why facial hair and the mustache in particular has become almost extinct. And that's because it seems like society villainizes the wearing of it. Seriously, the words porn stash and even worse, pedostache, all that implies that you're some type of sexual deviant if you're wearing a mustache. In fact, those two words right there are going to be more familiar with people than the actual proper names of mustaches. Seriously, pop quiz right here. What is this particular style of mustache? Do you know? This is called the chevron. All right, so I'm going to throw you guys an easy one. You've got to know this one. Come on, look at, yeah, this one is the handlebar. And this one right here, I mentioned earlier, not as popular nowadays, actually seen as evil. I don't know for why. Right here, we've got the pencil. Well, actually, maybe we do know why. The author of 1000 Mustaches, he talked about the history of the mustache, especially in Christian religion, and how it was associated with the devil. So the popular image of Satan was depicted off of the Greek god Pan, who had a pencil-thin mustache. In addition, think of all the villains you've seen as a kid that are depicted with mustaches, especially in the case of twins. How do you differentiate the bad twin from the good twin? You give the bad twin a mustache. How do you identify the bad guy? He's got that, that skinny mustache. He's got that Russian accent. Yes, being married to a Ukrainian, she has noted that almost all bad people in movies seem to have some type of Slavic accent. And let's not forget about all the sexual deviants, especially in the 1990s, 2000s. And just look at Napoleon Dynamite. You got Kip, you got Uncle Rico, both of them sexual deviants, and they got those mustaches. Yeah. That being said, if coach had put him in the fourth quarter, he would have won that game. They would have won state, and he would have thrown that football over that mountain. So this next reason why mustaches have disappeared, I really haven't seen anyone talk about, and I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments below. But my thoughts, and this is based off some 1989 research that showed that men in more masculine environments, basically surrounded by all men, they're more likely to have facial hair because they want to exert dominance over other men, not because it's going to be attractive to women. So as more women entered the workspace, especially in teaching spaces, all of a sudden you had just tons of women. And because there were less men, you didn't have to sport any type of facial hair, no mustaches or anything to exert dominance, because simply you just being a man, all of a sudden that was enough to actually show who you were, versus, again, around other men. Now, this point's important because a lot of guys think that facial hair, mustaches, beards, that they wear them because they want to attract women. Well, here's the thing is women, there are some women that are drawn definitely to mustaches and facial hair. But in general, women look at a number of factors, and they look at your rank in the hierarchy. That's one of the biggest factors they look at, your ability to provide based off of how other men treat you. And to further back this up, they did the survey of 6,000 men, and they found that men with mustaches on average made 8.2% more than men with beards and over 4% more than men that were clean shaven. So why did mustaches disappear? Because over the last 150 years, so many factors have conspired against them. Laws banning the mustache and facial hair. Women actually saying, you know what, this isn't a preference of mine. I'm not going to vote for you if you're wearing a mustache. All of a sudden, fashion trends start to go against this. We see the guys at the top sporting that clean shaven look. So guess what? We follow suit. And if you try to buck the trend, if you decide I'm going to wear a mustache no matter what, guess what? You are portrayed as the villain, as the bad guy, as the perv. All that being said, if someone were to ask me, should I grow a mustache? My answer would be yes, because there is so much good. And when you think about it at the base level, the whole idea here is interpretation and people pressing their views on something as simple as facial hair under the nose. Because if you think about it in its basest sense, when you choose to grow a mustache, you are making a choice. The majority of us that shave our entire face, we're conforming to a fashion trend. But anyone that's grown a beard, anyone that's grown any type of facial hair can tell you, when you make this choice, you're going to have some people in your life that are going to be against it, other people that are going to support you, half-ass, other people that are going to, a few that are going to say, welcome to the club. But at the end of the day, you are making a choice about how you present yourself to the world. In a nutshell, gents, I think mustaches are as nuanced as the men who wear them. Opting to wear a mustache, you are opting to be remembered. You're opting to stand out. You've made a choice that this is who I am and this is what I stand for. And I think that's a great thing. When you decide, you know what, I'm going to be looked over. And that's better than being overlooked. And yes, of course, some people that don't know you may find it creepy. Some people that know you may actually not like it. But if you can wear it with confidence, I think you'll be cool, collected, yeah, you can even be captivated. Guys, really quick, a lot of guys make a mistake. They think that just watching a video like this on YouTube is somehow going to make them an expert. Straight up, gents, you have to take this information and put it into action. And one of the best ways to motivate yourself to take action is to put yourself in a community, in a group of like-minded warriors, taking steps to improve their image, their presence, their presentation, and you can find all of that over at our community at skool.com/RMRS. Over in our Skool community, we've got detailed classes, we host challenges, and you can meet and engage with like-minded men taking steps on a daily basis to become their best self. So gents, instead of saying someday, how about you say day one and join our community? I'm putting the link down in the description, in the comments, or you can just go directly to skool.com/RMRS. The year is 1915, and a baseball rookie named Babe Ruth has just hit his first home run. The first long-distance, coast-to-coast telephone call has happened in the United States. A patent clerk named Albert Einstein has just presented part of his theory of general relativity to the Prussian Academy of Sciences. And the city of Detroit just got its first stop sign after the 1 millionth Ford has rolled off the production line. Now, the Europeans, they're at war again, but here in the United States, we're also focused in on the revolution going on down in Mexico. However, the German sinking of the Lusitania has grabbed the Americans' attention. All that being said, watch manufacturers, specifically pocket watch manufacturers, because that's pretty much the only type of watch being made, they are doing good. Since that tragic 1891 incident in Kipton, Ohio, whenever you had those two trains hit, all of a sudden new standards across the board, manufacturing shot up, expectations for timekeeping went up, but the demand did as well. So now we've got millions and millions of men around the world have the pocket watch. Now, what exactly is a pocket watch? Well, it's very similar to a wristwatch. You're going to see a lot of the same parts here. We've got the bezel, we have the hands, we have the dial, we have the overall case, and we've got the crystal on top. But notice how the case doesn't have lug ends, and it doesn't have any place for a bracelet to attach. Now, at the top of the pocket watch, we're going to see the pennant, we're going to see the crown, and where you attach the chain, the bow. And those chains, sometimes very ornamented, other times very simple, could be made from a precious metal, could be made from steel, could be even using string or leather. It really depends on the wearer and how they wanted to style it. Now, there were wristwatches being made, but they were mostly for women, and it was seen as a woman's accessory. I mean, there were a few visionaries like the guy named Wilsdorf, who founded a company you may have heard of called Rolex in 1905, eventually took it from England over to Switzerland. But yeah, he saw the trend coming, and that's where he positioned his company. And even earlier than that, Louis Cartier had a friend, Santos, a pilot, and said, you know what, in 1904, I'll let you wear this, wristwatch because it's going to be a lot easier when you're flying that plane to be able to check the time than, trying to pull a watch out of your pocket. But the reality is, entering World War I, the vast majority of men, if they had a timepiece, it was going to be a stylish pocket watch, one that they would wear right in their waistcoat. A lot of these officers, a lot of these men who joined up, they actually took them right into battle with them and started to use them. All that being said, at the start of World War I, it's safe to say the pocket watch was the dominant timepiece for men. It was fashionable. It was something, if you had a little bit of money, if you wanted to be, you're a guy of means, or just from a functionality standpoint, you had a timepiece, you had a pocket watch that you carried with you, and it was, something that looked good, something that was a great accessory for men. So what happened? Well, guys, I did my research and I found one particular incident, one thing that happened in 1917 that I think really doomed the pocket watch. But before I get into that, let's talk about the history of the pocket watch and where it came from, why it even exists. So the idea of timekeeping has been pivotal in the advancement of man over the last couple thousand years. We go back to the Egyptians, we go back to any large society thousands of years ago. What did the Romans use? They had sundials. You could tell basically what time it was in general by the position of the sun. Now, the earliest clock tower we've got on record goes back to Athens, and it was called the Tower of the Winds. And this actually had 8 sundials. It also had what was known as a water clock. Wasn't super accurate, but it did a decent job of helping the people be able to tell the time. Why was timing important? Because you needed to know when to start work, when to stop work. And if you're going to be doing processes that require you do them for a set amount of time, it was important that you were able to track it. Now, the Chinese, as early as 1088, they actually had clock towers using liquid escapement mechanisms. Again, relatively accurate, and you may be wondering, okay, well, if you're not in there, how can you actually tell the time? Well, the big thing with clock towers wasn't that you could actually see the time on a big dial, it was actually you could hear it. So they would have bells that would ring every hour. It wasn't about the minutes, it was about the hours, and that right there, all of a sudden, everyone within the vicinity could hear the bells ring at a set time and know what time it is. Now, as large spring-driven clocks became more popular throughout Europe, in the 15th, 16th century, we started seeing a race to actually make them small. And I'm talking really small. All of a sudden, the idea that you could have something that you could hold in your hand, and these were still relatively large. We're talking like 10, 15 pounds. But the idea is you could actually hold something that could accurately tell you the time. This was a big deal. And it was expensive. So as you can imagine, the only people that were able to afford something like this would be royalty. You would see maybe really high-level noblemen, maybe some merchants with a lot of money. These kind of people would be able to afford a timekeeping piece. And it was really just a show of opulence. It was a show that you actually had the money to be able to spend on this. And in turn, it eventually started, as they became a little bit more common, easier to manufacture, it became a functional piece. When I say functional piece, it became a fashion item that a lot of women actually loved to wear. They were called Nuremberg eggs. And these were actually attached to chains made from, or at least encased in precious metals. And they pretty much served the purpose of jewelry. And they were accentuated your outfits. And they had a small timekeeping device, sometimes even hooked up with an alarm. And again, it was all about a show that you had the wealth to actually own something like this. Now, in the 17th century, there was a big fashion trend. All of a sudden, men started wearing these smaller pocket watches that would fit in your pocket. They were that small, and it was just a fashion piece. It was be able to pull something like this out around people. It showed that you had means, that you had money, that you basically had something they didn't have. Now, to better fit in pockets, the shape evolved, and the technology, the technicians, everything at this point was handmade. Nothing is mass manufactured. So all of a sudden, everything is geared towards, yes, getting it thinner, getting it smaller, getting it so, yeah, the smaller, the better. And again, it was a race to the bottom here. And we actually know how valuable these watches were because we can go look at old newspaper clippings. Stolen watches, apparently it was a big deal. People were offering 5 guineas, which is a big amount in that time, for just information on the whereabouts of my stolen watch. By the end of the 18th century, though, you started to see watches just start to reach the masses. In fact, a lot of sailors could afford a watch that they would take on their journey. You know, when you're out on the ocean, especially if you're crammed, in bad weather, it's nice to be able to actually know what time it is when you don't see the sun for a while. It happened to me on a boat. I remember not going up for like 3 or 4 days. I mean, these were huge boats in the Marine Corps. We're always riding with the Navy, but you kind of want to know what time it is. Now, what about wristwatches? Well, the oldest one they can find is going back to 1806. It was made for a woman, Josephine de Beauharnais. I probably just slaughtered her name, but this was seen as a woman's watch, as a woman's fashion. And there were a few other people. I think it was the Queen of Naples had a wristwatch made for her in 1810 by the watchmaker Abraham Louis Breguet. And Patek Philippe apparently in its records had that it made a watch for the Koschwitz of Hungary in 1868. And from a functionality perspective, wristwatches were seen as not as accurate as pocket watches. Pocket watches could be a little bit larger in general than the wristwatches, and the expectations, especially again after that train incident over in Ohio, all of a sudden there was a set number of jewels. There was a set specification that the watches had to be made to. I think it was like within 30 seconds you couldn't lose or gain time in a month. So there was just with that higher expectation of timekeeping, which was a big deal. Nowadays we take it for granted because all of our electronic phones, they sync and everything. But at the time, and what led to that big train incident was the conductor's watch was 4 minutes off, and that led to 2 trains colliding, and I believe close to 10 men died. And it actually led to what is known as the General Railroad Timepiece Standards that they were adopted in 1893 by all railroads. Now, most companies don't want regulation from the government, but I'd say that this was a boom for watches because all of a sudden they had to step it up. And when they were able to meet this, you had a number of new watch brands that actually just took the forefront and started manufacturing and really just growing quickly. Now, really quick, we're going to have a little bit of fun here. Can you guess the watch manufacturer, they're still around today, that benefited most with these standards that were set? Now, their founder was appointed the chief time inspector by the railroads. Now, the founder's name, give you a little bit of hint here, was Webb C. Ball. Can you guess the manufacturer? Can you guess the modern watch company that still bears his name? Yep, pretty simple, Ball Watch. And I don't own any of them. If any of you guys have Ball watches, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear which one you've got. Speaking of watch companies with heritage, let's talk about one that did did a kind of a stunt in 1927. What they did is they gave a watch to British swimmer Mercedes Glitz, and she was swimming the English Channel. Now, this was the second time she swam the English Channel. The first time she did it, she had a few witnesses, but no one believed her. She's like, okay, I'm going to do it again. And this manufacturer said, you know what? Within, I think it was like a decade before, they had actually enacted what they called the Oyster Perpetual. Basically, they encased, and this was a big deal. For a long time, you had dust, you had little bits of sand, you had water getting into the movement, and it would just mess up the watch. So they actually found a way to seal this, and to show this, they actually would show off their watches in a aquarium, so down in water, to show off that they're waterproof. But this stunt right here actually put them on the map, and for 30 days they talked about it. Can you guess the watch company? Very famous. I was just talking about them, Rolex. Now, this next manufacturer over 150 years ago invented what's known as the stem wind, stem set movement. One thing I didn't get into and talk about is all those watches up to this time required a key that you carried with you as well. You had the watch, you had a key, and you would go in there and you would wind your watch. Oftentimes, multiple times a day. You wanted to make sure if you wound it too much, you could actually damage it. So this manufacturer, he was able to figure out how to get away with not having that key. Can you guess who it is? Patek Philippe. Yep, it was Adrian Philippe in 1842 that came up with this mechanism and definitely put them on the map when it came to watch manufacturing. Now, I hinted at this earlier, but I want to go into it to a bit more detail because I think it's really important to explain why the pocket watch just disappeared and the wristwatch in such a short amount of time was to come in and basically to eat its lunch. And that actually goes back to 1857. Here in the United States, we saw the American Watch Company of Waltham, Massachusetts introduced the Waltham Model 57. Now, this looked like a regular pocket watch, except for one thing. It used interchangeable parts. Now, here at Real Men Real Style, I talk about the interchangeable wardrobe and the power of it, but as you can imagine, with interchangeable parts in a watch, all of a sudden you had standards. It was like an assembly line. They were able to put this stuff together way before Ford was putting out, the Model T. You had these guys all of a sudden creating these assembly lines with watches. All of a sudden, watches could be more easily repaired. You didn't have to have, 20 to 30 years of skilled labor and, expertise to be able to go there and fix a watch. You could train a guy and within, a year, he's actually doing a really good job. So all of a sudden the cost to manufacture pocket watches started to plummet. They became more common for the average guy. And of course, manufacturers are cutting corners here or there. You always had the higher end watches, which you could tell by the numbers of adjustment to positions and things like that. Basically, every watch was individually made to all of a sudden you had models of watches being manufactured that they were all very similar. And the manufacturing industry was able to basically turn on a dime, turn much quicker and be able to pivot if something better came along. And that something was the wristwatch. Now, the wristwatch, everyone had known about this for a while, but again, it was worn by women. It was something that was very delicate. But here's the thing. The pocket watch wasn't really useful during the trenches warfare of World War I. You had to, reach in, you had to find it. It broke easily. So all of a sudden you had soldiers on the front in 1914 starting to adjust their watches, literally putting straps and attaching them to the outside of the uniforms. They would get broke. All of a sudden, they're putting like metal makeshift grates on top of them. But manufacturers took note of this, especially custom pieces. Officers had some money that said, hey, I want this made for me. Manufacturers started to take note. In fact, check out this watch right here. This is made by Waltham. It's got a metal guard right over the crystal. It was worn by soldiers in World War I. This one's in a museum. I mean, you can see the time, but you can see how tough guys were on these watches. And a lot of times they would even wear them outside, on top of the clothing. So it was something that did get a beating. It did get knocked around. But the big incident, the one I referred to earlier that happened in 1917, the War Office, basically over in England, they took note and they said, you know what? We are going to start to issue wristwatches to our soldiers. And that's exactly what they did. They started putting in big orders for these wristwatches. They adjusted it over time, but all of a sudden you had the average Joe, the guy fighting in the trenches and the officers all wearing these wristwatches that were issued to them by the military. Now, let's be clear. Hindsight is 2020, and looking back, it's easy to spot that date in that event and say, if, the pocket watch manufacturers would have shifted, they could have, so a lot of them could have survived. But it's hard to see it because after the war, People started, yes, wearing these wristwatches, but there were a lot of advantages still to the pocket watch. It was more accurate, and it was still, railroads required it. They still had their position. Let's just face it, a lot of companies, they rest on their laurels, but you did have these up-and-comers, Rolex being one of them, that said, you know what, the wristwatch is the future. So the 1920s, the 1930s, all these veterans, they loved that wristwatch and they kept wearing it. All of a sudden, it was no longer a lady's accessory. And by the early 1930s, all of a sudden, it had flipped. We saw a 50-to-1 advantage for the wristwatch. Yeah, you heard that right. For every 50 wristwatches being sold, only one pocket watch was being sold by 1930. So why did the pocket watch disappear? It comes down to the 3 F's. First up, function. As we saw, World War I clearly showed that the wristwatch has an advantage over the pocket watch when it comes to being able to quickly and accurately be able to check the time. Maybe not accurately, but let's just say that the wristwatch very quickly caught up. By the 1940s, 1950s, wristwatches were just as accurate as pocket watches, and even conductors. Eventually, the regulations disappeared once they realized there's another option out there. And with the rise of the automobile, all of a sudden people flying all over the place, you saw pilots. They were wearing a wristwatch because, again, who had time to reach into their pocket and pull out a watch when you could just simply flip the wrist and be able to see accurately what time it is? We also saw the rise of a wide range of different styles of wristwatches. Now, this first style is simply taking the classic design, putting it on a leather strap. Can you guess what style this is? That's right, the dress watch. Very simple design. I like dress watches. Other watches we saw put onto steel bracelets, or maybe a NATO bracelet, but these were made to be really functional, to be able to go diving in the water. What kind of watches am I talking about? The classic dive watch. Now, what about for pilots? What about people that wanted to be able to have a large face and possibly even have the tools to be able to determine, basically the direction and the speed that they're going? Well, that is the classic chronograph. And the nail in the coffin for the pocket watch, we saw the rise of the quartz watch. And this also almost killed most mechanical watches in general, but thank goodness they survived, and today they are still sought after. But the quartz watch, in case you're not familiar how this works, basically you have a quartz crystal, a little bit of electricity is run through it, and it's able to more accurately tell time than pretty much any mechanical watch out there. They're just amazing and they're incredibly cheap. And the Japanese almost took over the entire watch industry with the mass manufacturing of these watches. But again, when it comes to being able to accurately tell time and at a low cost, you pretty much can't beat a quartz watch. Now, the second F, that second reason why the pocket watch disappeared, fashion. And let's face it, men, they like to think that they're immune to fashion. No, they follow it just like everybody else. This is something that's, I think, innate in human beings. We see it in chimps. Like there's a whole study. One of them put a feather, next to its ear. All the other chimps started putting feathers next to their ears. Here's the thing. When other men saw other men just simply wearing the wristwatch, yes, functionally it worked. And they probably knew that for a while, a lot of guys. But, it became acceptable. You wore this during the war. You started wearing it after the war. All of a sudden, even men that didn't serve or their fathers, they're wearing these wristwatches. It is a fashion trend. All of a sudden, men wanted to wear these wristwatches. They wanted certain brands that all of a sudden were sending that signal of status. They were expensive. They were well made. They were accurate. The brands that were associated with this, all of a sudden, modern marketing started jumping in here. But we saw basically fashion brands start to push out, again, Patek Philippe, Cartier, all these other ones that did I mispronounce those? Hopefully I got those right. You guys, I can't pronounce anything that's French or luxury, but hey, I try. Point being is fashion took over here, and we saw the watch for, coming in still today is a fashion item. Anyone that wears a watch today to tell time, yes, you can do that, but that's not the primary purpose. I've got a cell phone, I can check, get it more accurate time through there. No, this is a status symbol. It's also something that carries a story, something that many people it's enjoyable to wear a watch. It's a great accessory piece. It's something that works great with outfits and even enhances them. And that's why men started to wear them, and they continue to wear them. The function is nice, but the fashion is really why they've stuck around. And speaking of fashion, let's talk about the third F. Why did the pocket watch disappear? Because the fall of the waistcoat. So with pockets, and this, I didn't get into the history too much, you always had this waistcoat that had been around for hundreds of years, and it had a pocket specifically designed to hold a pocket watch. You saw this in the 1700s, the 1800s. A waistcoat was incomplete without a pocket watch and a chain. It just all worked together. This was the fashion, this was the style, and all of a sudden in the 1930s, 1940s, we saw with the rationing of clothing, the waistcoat pretty much disappear. In the 1950s, unless you're getting nowadays, unless you're getting something custom made or you go to a specialty store, you're not going to see those waistcoats. A lot of guys are even choosing, if they buy a waistcoat, to get it with no pocket. So as the waistcoat disappeared, this was a double whammy to that pocket watch that used to go with it. So many guys, again, they would get the two together, they would get them so that they would work. But with the disappearance of the waistcoat, the fall of it, all of a sudden we saw the pocket watch start to leave as well. All right, so now opinion time. Do I think that pocket watches are ever going to make a resurgence? And the answer is yes, because we've already seen them do that. In the 80s, the 90s, with the rise of the waistcoat, a lot of men started actually picking up pocket watches, whether they be new or vintage. And a lot of companies still manufacture them. If you look around, you can find them out there. And we also see them, just popular with different cultures, different subgroups. Punk rock, steam rock. We see a lot of these guys actually love to bring back this vintage piece because it works with the outfits, with the looks, and therefore we do see them out there. Do I think mass acceptance bringing this thing back? No, because at the end of the day, I do think the wristwatch is just a better solution. So in 1925, approximately 35 million hats were produced in the United States. Per the US population at that time period, that comes out to approximately one hat per man per year. The popular hats at the time were the fedora, the Homburg, the bowler, the newsboy, the straw boater, and the Panama. Gents, it's safe to say if you were to go outside during that time period, you would not see a man out walking around without a hat. In fact, Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn were just talking about this over on their podcast about how hats were everywhere. It didn't matter if you're rich, poor, dressing down, dressing up. When you walked out of your house, you had a hat on. Fast forward 50 years to the 1970s, the total US population has more than doubled. But the number of hats being sold in this country, well under 2 million. Walking around during this decade, you're lucky to see 1 in 100 men wearing a hat. So what happened in the span of less than half a century? Why did men abandon their trilbies and fedoras? Were hats a fashion trend that just fell out of style? Or were hats a casualty of a cultural shift? Well, gentlemen, the answer to these questions is actually in this picture right here. Do you see it? Well, don't worry, gents. If it's not obvious, it will be by the end of this video as we dive into solving the mystery of why did men stop wearing hats. Now, to understand the decline of hats, we first have to understand the rise. Why did men start wearing hats to begin with? Now, for thousands of years, men and women have used hats both to protect themselves and as a sign of social status. But starting in the 1700s for men, this became uniform across Europe and the United States in the form of the bicorn and the tricorn hat. Favored by the military, favored by wealthy men, and men that worked outdoors, the bicorn and the tricorn hat was a relatively easy to produce and very functional piece of headwear that protected the wearer's head from the elements and kept them warm. And this needs to be emphasized because in the modern world today, we don't spend much time outdoors. But go back just 100 years, the majority of men worked outdoors. And if you traveled during the day like most people did, you were going to be exposed to the sun for sometimes hours at a time. So protecting the head was important. Now, tricorn and bicorn hats were made from a variety of different materials, and a man was able to show off his status by the material the hat was made of, and occasionally decorative accessories and details sewn and built into the headwear. By the 1800s, the bi and the tricorn hats are out, and we see the rise of the top hat, which, by the way, this hat is still worn at certain occasions in various parts of the world. But the top hat, by its very design, is more of a sign of status than it is a practical day-to-day piece of headwear. The rise of the top hat also marked a big shift in population densities, going from rural areas to the cities. Basically, during the 18th century, the industrialization age, we see people migrating from farms to the cities for factory work. Those that were fortunate or maybe cunning, devious, however you want to describe it, enough to make it to the top, wanted to be able to show off that wealth and that status in the way they dressed, and the top hat became very popular, especially in larger cities like New York, London, Chicago, and Paris. And the bowler, by the way, emerged in this time period as a more practical day-to-day wear hat. By the 1880s and 1890s, as more and more men started to earn more money than they had ever earned, and because of still the practical need of headwear and its social status, in the year 1900, we saw the peak of hat sales at over 42 million in a single year. Just to give you an idea of that number, that was more than the male adult population. So with 1.4 hats being sold for every man, we saw a number of different styles start to emerge, like the fedora, the Homburg, the newsboy, and the flat cap. So by the 1920s, it's safe to say we have reached peak hat. The average man has anywhere from 3 to 5 hats in his wardrobe, and no self-respecting guy would ever leave his home without one on his head. So what happened to the hat? Why did men stop wearing it? Why did sales plummet? Now, based off my research, I've got 5 reasons right here. Let's go through and break them out. Now, this first reason was a shift in demographics, specifically where we are spending our time. The reality is from 1870 to 1970, the amount of men spending time outside, it completely flipped in terms of percentages. In 1870, a man would spend 10 to 14 hours outdoors. In 1970, he was spending on average less than an hour. The big shift here was from rural farm work to men moving to the cities, having factory jobs, having service jobs, and the rise of the white-collar industry. As men spent more and more time indoors, they realized and they stopped buying the headwear that would protect them when they were outside in the elements. Now understand, this was a gradual process. Men are creatures of habit. If you had been wearing a hat for the first 20 to 30 years of your adult life, most likely you continued that habit. You just had less opportunities to wear it. But it's that new generation we need to pay attention to, especially the baby boomers. We had a huge surge in new births from 1945 to the 1950s. All of these new young men entering the workforce in the late 1960s and 70s, for them, there was no habit attachment to wearing a hat, and they were quick to abandon it. And that takes us right into the youth culture, rebellion, the changing of fashion. It's safe to say in the 1960s, we saw a cultural revolution. From the rise of Elvis Presley to the rise of the Beatles, from the mods to the hippies to the counterculture rebellion, post-war generations did not want to associate themselves with their parents. They wanted something different. One of the biggest ways to be able to separate yourself from your father was to stop looking like your father. Tons of young men started to reject the conservative dress code. They wanted to dress in a manner that they felt was more suited to them, but not even realizing it, they were falling into the 1960s and 1970s fashion trends. On top of that, let's talk about cultural icons. So JFK was noted, yes, he occasionally wore a hat, but JFK pretty much did not wear a hat in most appearances, to include his inauguration, which was a very cold, chilly day in DC, but the guy he just wore his jacket up there, did not wear a hat. And this moment, captured on television, seen by tons of young, idealistic men, was basically a nail in the coffin of headwear. And again, JFK wasn't the only cultural icon. As Hollywood became more popular, especially with the younger crowds, we see guys like Marlon Brando, James Dean, and other silver screen heroes looking stylish, looking cool, all without anything on their heads. Now for this next point, let's go back to that picture I showed you earlier. I said it would become obvious. One of the cultural shifts, one of the habits that is seen as a culprit when it comes to the demise of the hat. Do you see it now? Gentlemen, it's the rise of the automobile. So funny enough, when cars were first manufactured, they didn't have roofs, and there wasn't an issue to be able to wear your top hat right there in the car. But as cars became more popular in the 1920s, 1930s, all of a sudden we started to see roofs, and manufacturers realized it didn't make a lot of sense for us to make raised roofs to accommodate those hats. Let's just lower the roofs and encourage men to take the hats off. Now, of course, a lot of guys are wearing flat caps or newsboys that get away with wearing their hat in the car. But for most guys, especially if you're a little bit bigger, a little bit taller, you're going to have to take off that Homburg, that trilby, or that fedora when you get into your car. And as Americans and the world started to spend a lot more time in their vehicles, they realized the function of the hat, protecting them from the elements, all of a sudden became unnecessary. By the early 1950s, every respectable American family wanted to own at least one automobile. And as this became their primary mode of transportation, they spent a lot more time in it, not wearing their hat. Another interesting point about the rise of the automobile is that became a bigger class signifier than the wearing of a hat. Now, hats by and of themselves were never a true indicator of status. It also went with your clothing and the way you presented yourself. But in the last 100 years, as we have moved towards a more casual society, we've seen that people using class and status indicators through clothing has actually dropped off. Although interesting, it still has a big effect on people. Hence, I always encourage you guys to dress in a manner that you're sending the message you want to without saying a word, by wearing the appropriate clothing. Now, this point, improved comfort technology gets overlooked a lot, but it really was the death toll of the hat. Now, depending on what study you read, you lose like 10 to 25% of the heat from your body through your head. In any case, I know when I'm walking outside, if I don't have a hat on, I just feel a lot colder. And that was the thing. Wearing a hat was practical, especially when most men were walking around or you're traveling maybe in a train that's unheated, working in an office that is relatively cool. But with the advent of better heating systems, not only in public transportation and in offices, but also in private automobiles, the amount of time a man spent actually in the elements exposed to extreme cold fell dramatically, and all of a sudden the practicality of wearing headwear day to day disappeared. In a period of 50 years, how did suspenders go from being an essential part of every stylish man's wardrobe to now becoming an accessory that's so rare that most stores don't even carry them? In fact, nowadays, belts outsell suspenders by a margin of 100 to 1. Well, the answer to that question is actually right here in this photograph. Look close. Do you see it? And no worries if you didn't, because here at the end of this video, you're going to be able to spot the detail I'm talking about. In fact, by the end of this video, gents, you may decide to go out there and get a pair of suspenders, because as you probably know, there are so many benefits to wearing them. When compared to a belt, suspender wearers swear by the superior comfort of their AKA braces. Now, the reason for this is suspenders distribute the weight across the shoulders, versus with a belt, you're cinching around the waist. Another advantage, if you got a hard to fit body type. If you're a bit rounder around the midsection, you're going to find suspenders simply work better than a belt. And straight up, a lot of guys just like the look. The freedom from the tightness around the waist for a lot of guys just gives a better fit. And I've seen guys report that when they wear suspenders, they actually stand up straighter. Oh, and did I mention they're timeless and perfect for formal wear? Now at this point, you may be asking the obvious question. If suspenders are so perfect, why did men stop wearing them? So to answer this question, I need to test your knowledge of fashion history. Actually, it's more of a question I had as I started doing research for this video, and that is, how did ancient men or even men in the 16th century keep their pants from falling down to their knees? Because belts as a tool to hold up pants have only been used for about 100 years, and suspenders only a little bit longer, just coming in on 300 years. So what were guys doing going back 400 or even 4,000 years ago? Well, the earliest device that we have archaeological evidence that men used as far back as 5,000 years ago was the drawstring. Basically a simple string made from an animal hide or a fabric. Drawstrings provided a basic method of tightening the clothing around the waist. Now in the medieval ages, we saw the rise of the girdle. Similar to a belt, these were tied around the waist and they would secure a tunic, robe, or other garment. And depending on how much money you had and where you stood in society, you could decorate these with embroidery, precious stones, or even a metal buckle. Now in the 15th century, we saw the rise of the codpiece. See what I did there? But seriously, besides highlighting the crotch, the codpiece actually did have a little bit of a functional role, as it helped a man's doublet, his jacket, connect to his trousers, the hose, and it helped everything stay in place. And in the 16th century, when breeches became more popular, we saw the rise of the sash. And although they did provide a functional aspect, most sashes at the time were decorative. Now, the point I want you to take from that history lesson is when it comes to holding up your pants, your decision of the tool you use is less of a choice as it is a matter of fashion, which is an important point because it emphasizes our current love affair with belts isn't so much a conscious decision, but a fashion trend that we're currently in. So we trace the birth of suspenders back to 1736, when a French ribbon manufacturer began producing and selling decorative suspender straps. Now, these early iterations were connected to the trousers with buttonholes, which is a tradition that continues today. And over the next 100 years, the fashion and the industry of suspenders flourished. And as mentioned earlier, the reason for this was the simultaneous rise of breeches. These knee-length trousers became all the rage, and as more men wore them, the need from keeping these breeches from falling down all of a sudden became evident. Now, early suspender materials really depended on how much money the person had to spend. A man that was working class perhaps would go with a cheaper cotton or a very simple durable leather, while a man of higher status that had more means could go with a beautiful pair made from silk or a combination of all three of those materials. But the big innovation with suspenders came in 1822 when Albert Thurston brought the X and Y designs, which we see on the back of the suspenders, to the masses. At about this time as well, we saw the use of elastic materials, which made suspenders not only more comfortable, but ensured they maintained a snug fit throughout the day. And by the mid-19th century, during the Victorian era, this was the height of suspender usage. Throughout Europe and North America, suspenders were seen as an essential men's accessory. That being said, it was one of those accessories that most people didn't even see on a man because it was considered underwear. It was one of those items that was worn under the jacket, and men did not take off their jackets in public. Still, if a man had means, if he had money, he would oftentimes go with a decorative pair. For certain industrialists or aristocrats, it was one of those small details that sent the signal you had the money to spend on those little details that most people, well, just aren't going to spend the money on. Because at this point, everybody had a pair of suspenders. It didn't matter if you were a farmer, if you were a laborer, you owned a pair of suspenders because it was the only practical item in your wardrobe that would keep your pants up. But the dominant position that suspenders held in menswear was about to end. So the belt, as we know it, has only been used to hold up men's trousers since really the 1920s. Prior to that, and for thousands of years, belts were used as a utility item. For thousands of years, leather belts have been used to hold weapons, gear, and other items that could be strapped to them. Now, this may sound cumbersome to many, but when you're riding a horse and you need quick access to a weapon, a utility belt is incredibly functional and a great tool that in my time in the Marine Corps, I still saw used. But as an accessory to hold up clothing, it really didn't make sense, especially in the 1890s, 1900s, because most men were wearing their trousers at their natural waist point. And this is important to note. Notice that this is where your natural waist is, not down where most of us are wearing jeans nowadays. Well, lo and behold, in 1914, the world falls into World War I. For the next 4 years, all the resources of the major powers around the world are going into combat arms. And as the resources for making clothing is scarce, all of a sudden, designers and manufacturers are trying to come up with new ways to be able to make garments so that they use less fabric. Well, one innovation that can save you about 10% when you're manufacturing a pair of trousers is to make the waist lower. Almost all shirts at the time were made long enough that they could make up this difference, and so we started to see some military uniforms and civilian clothing made with a lower rise. Which the rise in a pair of trousers is the measurement from the waist point all the way down to the length of the crotch if the trousers were laid out flat. Now, post-World War I, you got a lot of these soldiers coming back. They really liked their uniforms because they were more casual. They were actually more comfortable than a lot of the day-to-day formal wear that these guys have been wearing at home. And manufacturers started to oblige by producing more and more casual clothing to include this new style of trousers that had a lower cut, and strangely enough, these things called belt loops. And by the 1930s, the silver screen, the growing Hollywood industry, with stars like Clark Gable and Humphrey Bogart, all of a sudden put men in front of millions of people who were wearing these lower cut trousers. The manufacturers had picked up on this. Belts were being produced in mass. And because they had less parts than suspenders, and you saw a lot of demographic shift in the younger generations wanted to separate themselves from the older, more formal generations of yesteryear, by the late 1930s, we saw belt sales just about equal suspender sales. Well, from 1939 to 1945, again, wartime period, so we saw the manufacturing of civilian clothing really cut back. Belts went back to being a functional item on a uniform. Suspenders were still used in many of the uniforms of World War II. But post-war in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, once the GIs returned home, we continued to see the rise of the belt and the fall of suspenders. Again, Hollywood is having a big effect. We see guys like Cary Grant, James Dean, all wearing belts. This is the new style. The only guys wearing suspenders? Yeah, those are the guys that can't let go of old habits, the guys in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. In the 1960s and 70s, we see the counterculture movement, the hippies, all of a sudden take on the belts. Musicians like the Beatles, everyone's wearing belts and they're having fun with it. All types of casual styles, casual materials, it becomes a fashion item. And just as we think suspenders are going to die, guess what? The 1980s happened, Gordon Gekko, the whole Wall Street look, all of a sudden suspenders are back. Sales shoot up. All of a sudden the idea of a man of power, of a man that's in charge, wearing suspenders in a power suit. We see suspenders shoot up, but it's a false positive because by the 1990s, suspender sales again are in free fall. And that's where we're at today. Suspenders, you can find them in specialty stores, but they are a niche accessory that, to be honest, if you were to go into 100 men's wardrobes, you'd be lucky to find a couple that had a pair of suspenders. Now, getting back to that picture that I showed you earlier, can you spot now the detail that was the death knell for suspenders? If it's still not clear, let me show you another picture side by side. You see the difference? Yes, it is the position of the trousers, the waistline. That small detail right there, gentlemen, is the number one reason why suspenders fell off, why most men don't wear them today, is simply the trousers that we buy are not designed to be worn with suspenders. In fact, I hinted at it when I was talking about 1920, how we started to see trousers made with belt loops. Well, good luck nowadays walking into a store and finding a pair of trousers that doesn't have belt loops on it. In fact, if you want pants that are designed to be worn with suspenders, they're going to have that higher waistline, you pretty much have to get them custom. Throw onto that the rise of casual fashion and the impact of influencers. Yeah, the social perception of suspenders, despite them having tons of advantages, is that they're old-fashioned. And even a guy like me that has an extensive wardrobe, I can tell you that the number of times I've worn suspenders, I can count on one hand. So you throw on a jacket, you're stepping out to grab a newspaper. Headlines read, "The Armorous Titanic just launched in Belfast, Ireland. Amundsen became the first person to reach the South Pole. There are revolutions going on, both in Mexico and China. And both the US Navy and the US Postal Service are trying out this new invention called the airplane." The year is 1911. And as you're walking down the street in downtown San Francisco, New York, London, or Chicago, every respectable man you see is wearing a vest. Now, of course, they're wearing their vests underneath the jacket, and technically they're called waistcoats. But in any case, every single adult man owns at least a few of them. In 1911, we had reached peak vest. Based off some estimates, we would see over 20 million vests sold that year. With the total US population being well under 100 million, that figure as a percentage is even more impressive. But fast forward just 45 years to the mid-1950s, and all of a sudden we see that less than 10% of men are sporting vests. And by the 1970s, that percentage had dropped to under 3%. And what makes that number even less impressive is that the majority of men that still own waistcoats are only wearing them with formal wear, aka black tie tuxedos. So what happened to the waistcoat? Why did men stop wearing them? Well, the answer, gents, is right here in this photo. So do you see it? The clue is there, and I promise you, by the end of this video, it will be obvious to you. But before we get into why the vest disappeared, we need to first establish why men started wearing them at all. And the reason goes back to Charles II, who didn't want to be France's little bitch. Let me explain. So one of the most interesting things about the waistcoat is we know the exact date of its birth, 1666. And we know this because the documents are still out there. It was decreed that the king, Charles II, wanted to establish a unique English style. You see, the French had been the enemy for years. Yet when you looked at the way the English dressed in their court, it was 100% influenced, inspired, and in Charles II's mind, controlled by the French. And Charles II, he didn't like this one bit. In fact, he equated it with France making English its mistress. And the king was apparently egged on by the writer John Evelyn, who wrote in the pamphlet Tyrannus in 1661, "Would the great persons of England but own their nation and assert themselves as they ought to by making choice of some virile and comely fashion." And in 1666, when the waistcoat made its debut, he described it as the most graceful, virile, and useful mode that ever appeared at court. So at this point, the English are all full of themselves, elated because they have now set the trend. Which, by the way, is actually not the case, because Charles II had come up with the idea after seeing the styles of adventurer Sir Robert Shirley, who had actually borrowed it from the Persian court of Shah Abbas the Great. Now, the original waistcoat was actually really long. It would go down past the knees, and they were adorned, colored, and these things were pretty darn elaborate. And of course, they showed status because they were only worn by men of means that could afford to have them made. Now, by the 1700s, the garment was short, and we also saw a wide variety of materials. Initially, they used English wools, but a lot of men started to choose silk because it was just more elegant, it was beautiful, and it layered well. And from a practical perspective, the shortened version was actually very functional. Because it was sleeveless and cut close to the body, it provided the insulation layer of the most important part of the human body, the torso, and therefore was incredibly functional 3/4 of the year in England. Freedom from sleeves also made it really good workwear because you had full movement of the arms, and if you started to perspire, you actually had a little bit of venting in the armpits. And throughout the 1800s, the vest became commonplace. Overall, the styles became much more muted, and a man with money would have a range of waistcoats made. Silks for the summer for suits and formal wear, heavier wools and tweeds for whenever it got cold. And because these vests were also made from the same material as suits, all of a sudden you had the emergence of the three-piece suit. Now, functionally, if you're wearing a suit in the 1800s, the vest solved a lot of problems. First up, it kept your tie in place. Next up, it hid your suspenders, which, believe it or not, was a big deal because suspenders, your shirt underneath, all of these accessories, these were considered almost like underwear, and in a sense, they needed to be layered and covered. In fact, that's one of the reasons the vest has survived so long, because in formal wear, black tie, aka the tuxedo, a vest is worn to hide and create a more elegant look of where the shirt meets the trousers. In fact, if you ever look to grab a vest, make sure it is long enough. A vest, even with your arms raised, should still cover the meeting point of the shirt and the trousers, which on a side note was a lot higher in the 18th century because most men were wearing high-waisted trousers. But why we stopped wearing high-waisted trousers, that is a whole other video.
That's a great idea.
So at the turn of the century, we have reached peak waistcoat. Every respectable man that wears a jacket owns one, and most men own half a dozen or more in various materials. So what happened? Why did the waistcoat disappear? Let me start by asking, did you see that movie All Quiet on the Western Front? I loved it. I think it's one of the best anti-war movies I've ever seen, and it had me hooked right at the intro where we see clothing taken off the dead soldiers, washed of its blood, dried, then sewn back up, and handed to the new clueless recruits. So, what does that have to do with the waistcoat? Because in 1914, the world for the first time saw total war. Basically, you had countries dealing with shortages and having to make cuts in areas that previously they had no problem spending resource on. One of those big areas was the manufacture of clothing. So by the start of World War I, fabric rationing throughout Europe and even the United States was commonplace, and what you saw, a lot of civilian garments, they stopped making them. And the designers that were formerly doing runways, well, guess what? Now they're designing uniforms with conservation and functionality in mind. They wanted something that was durable that used the least amount of fabric. Now, vests and waistcoats still served a purpose. They were really good for providing an insulating layer, but they were made in less numbers, and most importantly for their life, they weren't made to be a part of uniforms. Now, after the Great War, things kind of returned back to normal. 1920s, 1930s, we again saw the production of the vest shoot up. Because again, it was functional and it was something men were used to wearing. But the numbers, at least percentage-wise, weren't like they were before World War I. By the early 1940s, the entire world is rationing their fabric and materials, and at the same time, we're seeing advancements in the way the fabrics are being made. They're more weather-resistant, more durable. They do a better job insulating. Well, with all these advancements in fabric technology, and again, uniforms did not leverage the vest. So you got all these GIs returning from the war, used to wearing more comfortable clothing than their fathers did. Well, guess what? By the 1950s, the demand and production of the vest has dropped significantly. So yeah, when you're looking at this image, it now makes a lot of sense, right? Now, the next reason the vest disappeared, let's talk about office heating. When we were at peak vest in 1911, we had a huge demographic shift happening. Tons of men throughout the world were leaving the rural areas and migrating to the cities for jobs that paid better. And in the year 1911, even if you worked indoors, it was a luxury if your office had indoor heating. And as that more than half American men still worked outside, and not to mention when they moved around transportation-wise, yeah, there was no heating in those train cars. That new invention called the automobile didn't even have a closed compartment. And a lot of guys were riding horses or in carriages going to and from. Obviously, by 1920 to the 1930s, things had changed. Indoor heating in the city has now become commonplace. Offices are still cool, but they're relatively comfortable. Inside a train for public transportation, it's now sealed better, and some of the fancier cars have heating. And speaking of fancy, those automobiles all of a sudden are starting to have sealed enclosures, and some of them even have heaters. And well, you can see where this is going. By the 1950s, indoor heating across the spectrum, with where men are spending their time, is commonplace. So the need for an extra layer to keep you warm, it's pretty much disappearing. Now, the next reason may seem a little bit less important, but it's incredibly powerful because human beings want to be like other human beings. Yeah, by the late 1950s and into the 1960s and 70s, all of a sudden we have tons of young men rejecting the old school styles of their fathers and grandfathers, and the waistcoat was a part of that style. In addition, with the disappearance of suspenders and the rise of the belt, all of a sudden wearing a garment to hide the suspenders didn't really make much sense. And his style became much more casual. We saw the rise of the jumper, the sweater. It had been around forever. Knitwear, that is, but it was often reserved for much more casual situations. However, by the 1960s, by the 1970s, knitwear and sweaters are becoming much more common daily wear for men. And by the 1970s and 1980s, you're seeing it even mixed in with formal wear. And because of its properties and ability to stretch, for many guys, they felt it was more comfortable, less expensive, and more functional than getting a custom-made vest. Because yeah, by the 1970s, they're becoming harder to find. Therefore, if you want to get one, you got to either go to a men's specialty shop or have it custom made for you. And as a former clothier, I will tell you, a well-cut vest that fits the body is one of the hardest garments to make. Seriously, ask any tailor for a vest to look good on a hard-to-fit body type. That thing has to be cut just right. That being said, if you're in decent shape, just make sure it fits you in the chest, get it with that adjuster in the back, and you will be just fine. So by the 1970s, men's style is much more casual. The two-piece suit reigns. And even that garment is starting to see a decline. So with all this bad news with the waistcoat, why didn't it disappear? Why did it stick around? Well, I mentioned earlier, the majority of vests are still sold today as a part of a formal wear outfit. In case you didn't know, when it comes to dressing black tie, there are actually set rules, which some people find off-putting. My answer to this is it makes it really simple. You just simply dress per the rules and the guidelines. And yes, if you want to change it up, you want to have fun, I always say you can break one rule whenever you're putting your black tie outfit together. But the rule in formal wear is that you need to cover the area where the shirt meets the trousers. Now you can do this with a cummerbund, which comes out of India and is a really cool piece of menswear, but the more traditional and more formal way to do this is to wear a proper black tie waistcoat. But having said that, why do we still see the waistcoat outside of black tie? Well, first up, unlike a lot of other items that have disappeared in menswear, the waistcoat for some is still functional. A small percentage of men out there still wear suspenders, and so they use a waistcoat to cover it. And I do find if you have a white-collar job where you spend a lot of time in the office, you're a lawyer, you're a banker, you're a consultant, you want to maintain a dressed-up appearance that allows the eyes to go up and down when you take your jacket off, which some guys like to do. You know, for that reason, the waistcoat just can't be beat. A lot of guys as well enjoy bringing in a bit of color. In case you haven't noticed, the waistcoat I'm wearing, the back of it has some really fun patterns and colors to it. And some guys out there who wear a suit on a daily basis love the color they can bring to their outfit when they wear an odd waistcoat, one that is made from a different material and sometimes even a striking color that brings a bit of pop to their outfit. There's also something to be said how it raises the V. On a 2-button jacket, you're going to find that the gorge where the left and right flaps overlap is actually relatively low. By wearing a waistcoat, you actually raise that V up and you can give your outfit a more formal look. So yeah, the 3-piece suit has become less popular, but it still survives because some guys just love it. In addition, it should be noted, I've been using the word vest and waistcoat interchangeably. Technically, a vest is a waistcoat that is made to be worn as outerwear. And that's another place where this garment has survived, especially in the Western wear scene. A well-fitted vest helps keep a tucked-in shirt from billowing out and going all over the place. In fact, one of my best friends, godfather to my daughter Katya, Ryan Mash, you can see him, he loves the waistcoat. He wears it all the time when he goes out swing dancing, and he loves how it brings a bit of color and a bit of style and flash to his overall outfit without getting in the way. In fact, if you're a photographer, I always recommend that they grab a good-looking waistcoat, because if you're at a fancy wedding, everyone else is wearing a jacket, but you're moving around working, it's a great way to have a more buttoned up look without retaining as much heat that would build up, with a jacket. And of course, I get to give a shout out to some of the subcultures out there like steampunk and the vintage fashion movement that have loved, maintained, and used and ensured the waistcoat lives on. So over in the community tab, I asked the question, should the cape make a comeback? And almost 60% of you said no. And I get it. Capes are old school. We've got coats. And I mean, who needs them? But oh my gosh, some of you guys were ruthless in the comments. What a ludicrous question. Gay, gay, gay. No. Corny ASF. Seriously, WTF? Only if you're Batman. I'm Batman. What the hell kind of question is this? Now all those comments were fine until I found this one. Unmanly. Craig Miller, what the heck are you talking about? Do you not know your history? Now, I want to start things off by saying, yes, I do own a USMC boat cloak. Now, I don't wear it on a daily basis, but in inclement weather, when I'm walking with my lady and I need quick access to my sword or AR-15, the cloak is a great tool to be able to keep you warm and to give you quick access to any type of weapon you may be carrying. But seriously, gents, the United States Marine Corps, along with other military and police units around the world like the Italian Carabinieri, allow their officers to wear cloaks with their uniforms. In fact, many units issue them, and the functionality aspect, because of the nature of the cloak's design, it makes it very easy to be able to grab a weapon or to be able to grab anything that's on your person underneath it. Let's start things off by getting our terminology correct. We've got the cape, we've got the cloak, and in between them, we actually have what's known as the capelet. Let me explain. So a cape is going to be a garment that is shorter than a cloak that usually goes below the buttocks, the midsection area, and it covers the back. Capes do not normally cover the front, although they can in some circumstances. Now, the cloak is going to be a longer garment. This is made to cover the full body and is made for protection. Most cloaks as well will have a hood or a head covering. Now, what's a capelet? kind of sits in between the two, usually covers up the shoulders and is longer in length. And to make this even more confusing, let's talk about the origin of the word cloak. Cloak is a French term. It comes from medieval Latin cloaca, and cloaca meant traveling cape. So cloak came from the word traveling cape, and the traveling cape got the name cloaca because it looked like a bell. Makes sense, right? Cloaca, clock, bell, time. Yeah. Now, getting into the history, how long have men and women been wearing cloaks? Well, pretty much since they've been wearing any type of clothing. The idea and the design of a cloak is so simple that we have seen this pop up in cultures all around the world. When we look at the earliest clothing that they were wearing, these were pelts that were shaped basically with room for their head to be able to stick out of and to be able to protect all around the body. And another big advantage of a cloak is simply that you can wear it when you're sleeping. You can wear this when you're walking around. It's basically, yeah, you're wearing your bedwear right here. And it was just incredibly functional. And again, didn't require a whole lot of sewing to be able to get the job done. Now, when it comes to recorded history, the first evidence that we see of a cloak, or I was able to find, was from about 500 BC. And this is on a cup that's over in the Louvre, and it's from ancient Greece. And it shows two people hiding under a cloak. Wonder what they're doing. But seriously, the Greeks are given credit, I think back to 750 BC for the himation, which was a variation of the cloak. The Romans eventually took it and ran with it, and their variation was known as the pallium. Now, as it seems like they did with a lot of things, the Romans took the Greek idea and they actually made it theirs, and in some ways improved upon it, or actually gave us the first idea that capes and cloaks could be used as differentiators for us to be able to see who a person is and their rank in society. Now, the simplest form of the Roman cloak was known as the paenula, and this was worn by both men and women. It was just a simple thing that you wore to show that, hey, I'm a part of the community. Now, higher up the rank structure, we had soldiers, and they were actually wearing sagums, and these were larger cloaks, a little bit longer, and they had specific colors. So if you're wearing a red one, you were a regular foot soldier. If you were wearing one that was scarlet, you were an officer. If you had a purple sagum, you were a general. And if you were a general, you wore what was called a licerna, and that was attached to one shoulder by a brooch on one side, and it basically was made in a color that it was very distinctive. People knew who you were. They got out of your way. You were in charge. You were the man. And this status symbol wasn't confined just to the military. We also saw Roman senators wearing licernas in purple as well over their togas. And by the way, the use of cloaks as a status symbol was not just a European thing. We saw this also over in North America. In fact, the ancient Aztecs wore what were known as tomatlis. So if you were a nobleman, if you were, the guy on top, if you were a priest, if you were a warrior, you wore one of these to signal who you were in society and at functions. Specifically, the most brightly colored, elaborately decorated tomatlis were reserved for the jaguar knights, for the eagle warriors, for the noblemen, for the priests, and for the emperors. Cloaks continued to be used for over 1,500 years, a very functional item, which, yes, they could serve decorative purposes. If you were a king, if you were a prince, if you were a nobleman, you would have just really high-end fabrics, gold, and other precious items sewn into the cloak that was decorative. But functionality-wise, the common man found, hey, this is just something that works. So we saw this popping up and used throughout medieval times. It was a simple garment that the peasants would use and a king would use, oftentimes to protect themselves from the elements. And that became the functional aspect of it. In fact, there was a whole class of mantle makers. That's actually, they were called mantles or mentals, but mental makers was a type of person that actually just made cloaks as a living. Now, for a garment style to have lasted for over 3,000 years, I really think that speaks to the overall usefulness and functionality of the cloak. But specifically, why did people like them? Why did we continue to use them? Well, one of the first things I mentioned is they're easy to make. You don't have to do a lot of sewing. Sewing machines didn't pop up till about 200 years ago. And before then, everything was hand sewn. So you didn't want to have to deal with a lot of seams. You didn't want to have to deal with a lot of sewing. That could be days, if not, months of work right there. So to have something that actually could just fit over the body, you make minor adjustments, you reinforce a few areas, maybe actually just use type of a fastener around the neck. All of a sudden, you've got an item which gets the job done. And to be specific, what do I mean getting the job done? I'm talking about protecting the body from the elements. We take it for granted nowadays in our modern vehicles, but people used to have to travel for at least a day, if not days at a time, just to simply go to the market, to go to the store. You would oftentimes be camping on the side of the road. You're traveling light because everything you're carrying is right there, either on yourself, you're walking, or you're on horseback. So what was great about this, I mean, this was an item that you could sleep in, an item that you could wrap up as a blanket, an item that actually the outside of these were made to be tough. So you would have these treated to be weather resistant. Now, hundreds of years ago, of course, they didn't have access to fabrics that were going to be water resistant, but they did have access to some fabrics that they could treat. So if you actually had, let's say, wax, you could wax the cotton, you could wax the linen, you could wax even the wool, and it would do a decent job of repelling the water. In addition, wool does a really good job of pretty much absorbing its weight in water without feeling wet. So it could take a light drizzle and you would still feel dry, and it would insulate you and keep you warm. Another characteristic that made the cloak really functional is how it would actually drape over the body without flattening a lot of items. This was important, especially back in the 15th century, whenever you had a lot of ruffles, you had a lot of, let's just say they're wearing fancy clothing, they spend a lot of time and effort, especially the noble people, and they don't want something heavy on it that's going to crush all those ruffles and the other looks they're going for. So you could put a cloak on this and it would do a good job of just draping on and not damaging the clothing. In addition, if you're just simply you're a guy with some means because you got a horse, but you want something that can drape over and still cover your legs and fit right on you when you're riding the horse. Guess what? A cloak did that. So this was, again, a very functional piece. Whether you're walking, whether you're riding a horse, this would keep your whole body warm. And I alluded to this earlier, but ease of access to your weapon. So 1500s, you're traveling through a forest a couple days. Yeah, you're going to be armed. You're going to be taking a weapon with you because there are bandits. There are just problems out there. I mean, today there are bandits out there. You've got to be careful. And what I loved about the cloak is that the overall, just the way it's built, is that from a distance, you actually can't tell if that person is armed or not. So simply, yeah, you're not sure. Is that, it's, 18th century? Is that guy carrying a flintlock? Is he actually, armed with a weapon that's going to stop you in your tracks? You don't know, so you want to be careful. So you want to be courteous. What is that? An armed society is a courteous society. Let's just say with cloaks, you didn't know what the other person was packing, and that was often a good thing. And if you did need to be able to pull out your weapon, you could just simply knock the cloak back quickly, grab your sword or your firearm. Why do comic book artists, why did they depict superheroes with capes? Why are they wearing cloaks? And I know some of my favorites: Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, never pulled it off, but Doctor Strange. Yeah, you see a lot, Thor, you see a lot of these superheroes, especially the older ones, wearing capes. What's up with this? It was all about movement and the illusion of being able to see where the character was going. Yes, you can do this with other tricks, but early on, it was so easy to be able to show Superman or Batman the direction that they're going based off of their cape, and the way that their cape is drawn creates a feeling of movement. Now, of course, as Edna Mode has pointed out in The Incredibles, no to capes because they are dangerous. And I do have to agree. I know this is something that popped up a lot in the comments. People were like, hey, we don't wear capes because I don't want to get choked. I don't want to get pulled off my horse. And these were real things that happened. So capes did have you had to be careful with these things, especially if you had a rope around there that would not break or would not release you. That could lead to disaster or getting pulled into a jet engine. All right, so now let's answer the question that you've been probably wondering. If capes are so darn useful, why did they disappear? What happened over 100 years ago that caused the cape to pretty much disappear from men's wardrobes around the world? So the first crack in the dominance of the cloak appeared in the 1830s, a little invention called the sewing machine. All of a sudden, sewing seams, long seams, didn't have to be done by hand. You had factories start to pop up in the 1850s, 1860s. All of a sudden, we're using this revolutionary machine to manufacture clothing that could be sold pre-made. This was huge. Before this, almost all clothing was handmade. All of a sudden, we had mass manufactured clothing, and guess what? Uniforms were being produced for wars. We had wars over in Europe. We had wars over in the United States, the Civil War. And guess what? The cape was not going to be a part of most uniforms. It was expensive. They were rationing clothing. And all of a sudden, they started forming this very functional item, which was now easy to manufacture, known as the coat. Now, coats had been around for centuries, but they were always expensive. And now with the sewing machine, with mass mass manufacturing and demand from wars, all of a sudden we saw the fashion trends changing. All of a sudden we saw coats become very functional, and it wasn't, you'd have to worry about crushing any fancy clothing underneath. You could wear this item and it did a very good job, especially if cut properly with the higher armholes. You had full freedom of movement. A lot of guys liked this. They got used to it and they ditched their cloaks. Now, cloaks continue to be worn, especially in upper society. They were worn with formal wear, white tie, black tie. It was an item that could go over that delicate clothing. You also saw variations of different types of jackets and coats that actually were a mix with the cloak, one of them being the Ulster jacket. The Ulster was a working Victorian daytime overcoat that had both a cape and sleeves. And at the beginning of the 20th century, things continue to get worse for the cloak. Why? We've got another war, World War I popping up. Uniforms are being ordered and everyone is really careful with the amount of fabric that they're using. We're going to be rationing this. We're going with simple practicality. Cloaks, capes are not going to be part of uniforms pretty much of any military out there. Everyone is keeping it simple. Even the Germans, during the middle of the war, they actually made all of their stuff much simpler to be able to save money. After World War I, you've got all these men coming back used to not having to wear a cape or a cloak, so they're not wearing them in their civilian gear. In addition, we had the rise of the automobile, and anyone that has worn a long jacket and tried to get into an automobile knows that the bottom of it always gets dirty, always gets stained. So we were transitioning from riding horses to going into automobiles, and all of a sudden, we're now working more indoors. We're not spending as much outdoors. All of a sudden, you had all of these forces conspiring against the cloak, and the cloak manufacturers, the ability to make them actually at good cost, all of a sudden started to drop because the skill, the ability to do it started to disappear. After World War II, the use of cloaks and capes in uniforms pretty much disappeared. And with that, the only place that we would ever see these is in formal wear. And with the dyeing of white tie, black tie, I know you can find it in some places out there, but really those are the only places that you're going to see these type of garments. You do have some military units, as I mentioned, my United States Marine Corps, and a few other ones out there that do maintain their cloaks, which is pretty cool. But yeah, these are really now a vestige of the past. Fast forward to the 1940s, we see another war break out, uniforms manufactured around the world, and guess what? Cloaks, coats are pretty much missing. Occasionally you would see ponchos, but with the ability to make coats that served a similar purpose and got the job done, yeah, you didn't really see these on uniforms. They were viewed as superfluous. 1950s, 1960s, you continue to see cloaks popping up in formal wear, but that's pretty much where you see them now out of tradition. So now let's answer the question, how to pull off a cape, how to pull off a cloak modern day times. How can you do this? Okay, so I mentioned a number of military units. Why not consider joining up? I know that if you showed up to a Marine Corps ball wearing a boat cloak, and you can back it up. You've been on a few deployments. You just are a salty dog. Guess what? You can pull that off, and you're going to everyone's going to be wanting to wear it, take pictures, and it is Marine Corps balls. What a great time. If you haven't been to one, you're missing out. But I know not everyone can pull that off. Not everyone is going to be able to experience that. So what about the rest of people? Well, maybe, look for inspiration. Lando Calrissian. I have a guy down in the comments. He was saying that he has 30 cloaks or capes. I wasn't sure which one he meant or what exactly he has, but he says he's been inspired by Lando and he is actually pulling these things off. And I think when it comes down to it, it is practicality. For me, I would say, is this actually going to do a good job of keeping the elements off of me? Is it light? Does it look good? Can I pull it off with my outfit? Do I practice wearing it? Do I feel good? And if you do, why not wear whatever you want to wear? But you are going to definitely be going against the tide, because here's the thing, it's not a fashion trend. Baseball caps right now are a fashion trend. Cargo shorts are a fashion trend. Socks with sandals seem to be a fashion trend, and that you can wear that stuff and no one's going to give you a second look. But yeah, you wear a cloak, you wear something that has a 3,000-year-old history, and people for some reason think you're crazy. But if that's you and if you want to pull it off, well, may the force be with you. And yeah, you make it happen. Maybe you want to go to the dark side. I mean, Darth Vader pulled the thing off. If you can force choke somebody, if you can jump over a tall building, go for it. You are authorized to wear a cloak or a cape at any time. The year is 1997. Hong Kong has just been returned to Chinese rule from the UK. Grandmaster Garry Kasparov is defeated by the computer Deep Blue at chess. In sports, Mike Tyson bites Evander Holyfield's ear and is suspended from boxing. A 21-year-old Tiger Woods wins his first Masters. And in the business world, Microsoft is the world's most valuable company at $261 billion as a gentleman named Steve Jobs returns back to Apple. And in the bag industry, when it comes to what professional men carry, the briefcase rules. Now, there is an interesting trend with messenger bags, basically briefcases with a strap. A lot of people seem to be using this, but the briefcase makers, now they're not too worried. They are going to be on top forever. Or are they? Now, first up, let's define exactly what a briefcase is. So a briefcase is a narrow, hard-sided, box-shaped bag or case used mainly for carrying papers and equipment with a handle. Now, there's a wide variety of styles out there, but the main ones are going to be a portfolio, which is a handless case that you carry in the hand under the arm. There's also the folio case, which is a portfolio with a retractable handle. And then there's the common attaché or diplomat case. This is a box-style case characteristically made out of leather, fitted over an internal hinged frame that opens into two compartments. As the name implies, it was originally carried by attachés when they had important paperwork that needed to be secured and they needed to be able to maintain it at all times. They didn't want that paper to bend. They wanted to protect it from the elements. This was a case made specifically to move important documents. And let's not forget about catalog cases. These are similar to attaché cases, except they are even bigger. Now, briefcases descend from the satchel, which was a 14th century bag carried by messengers, and the briefcase simply evolved. And usually, again, one of the key characteristics we see is a solid structure, a frame. Now, the idea of a hinged frame was first developed in Paris in 1826 with a carpet bag, and many other bags followed suit. It was seen as practical, it was seen as something functional, and the idea of being able to protect contents with a frame was accepted and just became very common in white-collar business professions. So from the 1850s onwards, they started to become more common, and if you go back, you look at any newsreels from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, it seems every businessman in a large city who had important things to move around was carrying an attaché, a briefcase, basically. In fact, if you think of a powerful man on Wall Street, yes, he's going to be wearing that suit, and what is he going to have? A briefcase. It's become synonymous with somebody that works in law, somebody that works in finance, especially in a big city. Now, backpacks, on the other hand, have a much more mixed history. You see them in cultures across the world, and they would have various names, and they would have various functions. In general, there are 4 categories of backpacks. You're going to see frameless, external frame, internal frame, and body packs. That being said, it was the frameless backpack, or maybe known as knapsack, rucksack, school bag, sack pack, book sack. Yep, tons of names, but the key characteristic here is you're going to be carrying it over your shoulders on your back. That's what separates this type of bag from all the other ones out there. Now, for most of their recorded history, they were just a practical bag that was used by hikers, by students, by travelers, and in fact, the word backpack didn't really appear in our lexicon till 1910. So what led to the fall of the briefcase? Well, we started to see the cracks in the wall whenever we saw the messenger bag rise, and the sales shot up. The messenger bag was kind of a variation of the briefcase. It was a mix, you had that big strap going across. You could wear it in a variety of ways. On one shoulder, you could carry it with a hand. You could strap it across the body. I remember even wearing this thing almost like a backpack. Point being is this was a pretty versatile bag, but it addressed a big issue, and that was the rise of the personal computer, the laptop I'm talking about. In those laptops, I had a huge laptop, and I needed to get a larger messenger bag. They were usually made out of a canvas material, relatively inexpensive, but they actually fit the need of the person. We looked at the briefcase as something that suits wore. So if you didn't wear a suit, but you still needed to be able to carry your new equipment, this really nice laptop that you wanted to take care of that still weighed like 10 to 15 pounds, you got a messenger bag. So with the rise of the laptop, we also saw just simply a culture of people that were rejecting dressing up. And again, the briefcase was associated with the suit. So between those two things right there, we started seeing cracks in the wall. All of a sudden, people were going towards, hey, what other options do I have to carry my important gear, which is no longer paperwork that will be shaped, but more of a computer that I want to make sure is cushioned and protected. Now, the next step in the evolution was understanding that comfort started becoming really important. And if you've ever had a messenger bag carrying about 30 pounds of stuff, you know that over time, it just really starts to hurt that one shoulder. That's why I started going cross carry with a lot of things. It was better, but still it didn't solve the problem. And I'm going back and forth. And I just felt like I couldn't run. I couldn't move really as easily. So all of a sudden, people started looking for alternatives to the messenger bag. And the backpack was right there, ready to step in. Now, I remember in business school back in 2005, the University of Texas at McCombs, they actually gave us backpacks. And this was my first backpack that actually had a cushioned space for a laptop computer. And this was in a business environment. All of a sudden, they were putting their stamp of approval. We saw all of a sudden backpacks start to evolve. All the backpacks I had had up to that point were pretty much like knapsacks. They didn't have any type of form to them. They didn't really have any protection for a laptop. And I'm aware that they were out before then. But all of a sudden, you saw business schools starting to give these to their students because, hey, we're students. Backpacks were normally seen as very casual, acceptable. At the same time, we had not only a lot of books to carry, but we had to protect our big investment, which again was that laptop. But if you disagree with me, guys, I want to hear from you down in the comments below. You guys know I love hearing your opinions. Antonio, you're full of crap. Antonio, you're exactly right. Guys, I want to hear what are your experiences with the briefcases versus backpacks. What do you think? Guys, let me hear it down below. So I want to reiterate, again, the backpack companies are starting to see the market. They're seeing the opportunity, not just in placing padding and giving a bit more structure to these backpacks for students, but also saying, can we go upscale? Because these students are taking these jobs. And can we, once they start making money, can we start making these backpacks out of leather, out of higher end materials? Bigger brands all of a sudden started coming in and charging higher market prices for backpacks that were very similar to the ones you had as a student, but now they had a fancy logo on them. Now they were made out of better material. The stitching, the sewing, the construction, everything started stepping up. And so now all of a sudden the functionality of the backpack started to shine, because one of the key things with a backpack compared to any bag that you carry in your hand is you're keeping the weight closer to the body. Any hiker knows this, and that's why you get the framed backpacks, but those are a little bit overkill. But with these new backpacks that were geared towards professionals, they had padding, they kept the weight close to the body, and so if you had 40 pounds, you had all of these books, you had your laptop, you had everything that you needed for a day, all of a sudden the backpack was shining through. And all of a sudden we started seeing that people were cramming. Men needed a lot more, and women as well. But I know as a professional student and then as a young professional, a lot of you guys are working out in the morning. You're leaving your home at 7 o'clock, maybe 6 o'clock in the morning. You're going to the gym, then you're going straight to work. You need everything. You've all of a sudden got not only your electronic components, laptop you took home, but you've got your phones, you've got just all these charging devices, all of the stuff you needed to take with you. So the backpacks started to become larger, at the same time providing structure. They were made more durable, so you saw the bottom being reinforced on these so they weren't falling apart. The straps they had to go through and reinforce all the straps. But you saw the evolution of this backpack, the size, not getting out of control, keeping everything having a place. More companies were manufacturing. And as this happened, all of a sudden, more people started picking up backpacks that were going into these professional jobs. Now, of course, in 2010, there were a lot of holdouts, especially in the conservative industries. There was just an understanding when you saw the people at the top still carrying around their briefcases. Maybe they were carrying around older messenger bags, but hey, they were carrying a bag. They weren't coming in with their backpacks. And a lot of people, they resisted this until they didn't, because they realized that, hey, one day they just bring in the backpack, maybe in 2012, 2013. And I was reading an article over at the Wall Street Journal talking about this in particular. I'm reading through the comments, all these investment bankers, all these people that are right there in the industry in Chicago, New York, Dallas, San Francisco, and all of these people are saying, hey, yes, we saw it coming in. We resisted it initially, and then I tried it, and then I realized that it is just practical to start wearing a backpack. And that is perhaps the strongest reason why the backpack is going to stick around, because people have both hands free. Yes, you could argue that, having one hand free for doors and for your coffee is going to be fine, but it was the advent of the smartphone and simply people working on the go and being expected to make things happen, even over their lunch break. So you're walking down the street, guess what you're doing? A lot of people, these professionals, they're right on their phone. Is it safe? No, but it's something that they're doing anyway. And they wanted to keep both hands free. I know just simply having one hand free to, maybe carry an umbrella, another one to carry my coffee. I mean, it's just nice to be able to have your hands free. And again, because we saw the industry shift, it took a while. It took over 20 years for the backpack to make its evolution, but I think it's safe to say in 2022, the sales of professional backpacks to briefcases has got to be a huge factor. The briefcase has really fallen in terms of total sales. And do I think the briefcase is dead? No, it's going to stick around because it has a very functional purpose, especially you see some of these made out of aluminum, made out of other metals. These are great for transporting very valuable items that, you still see people like handcuffing a briefcase to their arm because they don't want it taken. But also, I just think if you've got something that you want to make that the priority, it's not electronic. So if you're in the world of law, if you've got important documents, papers that you are transporting, and you don't want anything to happen to them, I can see the advantage of a case specifically designed to be able to move documents, to be able to protect them. Yeah, there's always going to be a need for this particular type. Is it going to reach the same heights that it once did in the 1980s, late 1990s? The answer, I think, is no. All right, Jen, so if you enjoyed this video, you are going to love this one. Yes, the whole Why Did Men Stop series. I've got a number of videos. I just find it really interesting. And if you love history, if you love really understanding why we do what we do, you're going to, just check it out. Solid video. Boom, right here. Oh, yeah.